My name is Alena Eising. I am librarian and curator for Slavic, East European and Eurasian Studies at the International and Area Studies Department at UCLA Library. And I am honored to welcome you to today's program entitled Literature, Politics and Identity. This is a program that is part of the UCLA series that was established a few years ago called Opening the Doors to Contemporary Literature. I am thrilled to see the incredible interest to today's event with registrations from all over the world, including Europe, and thank you all for joining us. As a public and land grant institution, UCLA acknowledges that our campus resides on the traditional land of indigenous people. We recognize the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the caretakers of Tongvanar of Los Angeles Basin. Today's program would not be possible without the generous support of the UCLA departments, for example, the Slavic and East European and Eurasian languages and cultures, the UCLA Center for European and Russian Studies, and the Ukrainian Arts Center in Los Angeles. I would like to also extend my gratitude to my colleagues at the UCLA Library for their dedication in bringing this event to life. Our department is dedicated to fostering global understanding and promoting access to international knowledge through our collections, research support, and public engagement. To officially open today's program, I would like to introduce Jennifer Osorio, the UCLA Library's interim associate university librarian for distinctive collections and director of library special collections. Jennifer's dedication to preserving and expanding our collection is invaluable, and her leadership ensures that the UCLA Library provides access to diverse and unique resources. She is supporting research and learning across cultures and discipline. And today's program exemplifies the UCLA Library's mission to foster international perspectives and scholarly exchange. Please join me in welcoming Jennifer Osorio, and she will tell you a few more words about our work.
Thank you, Elena. Welcome, everybody. I'm really happy to be here today and to know that there's such a great turnout for this event. This is a really exciting session of Opening Doors to Contemporary Literature, and we're honored to host this program with Andrey Kurkov, one of Ukraine's most celebrated novelists, and Dr. Roman Koropeckyj, who is an esteemed professor here at UCLA and who has been a great collaborator to the library and will lead our conversation today. The library's mission is to foster access to diverse resources from across the globe while actively building bridges for learning, engagement, and collaboration. Through events like this, we bring world-renowned voices to the UCLA community and beyond, encouraging a deeper understanding of the complex cultural, social, and political landscapes that shape our world. Today's program is supported by the UCLA Department of Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Languages and Cultures, as well as the UCLA Center for European and Russian Studies, and it's a testament to this mission, along with all the work that Elena has done to put this program together. By featuring Mr. Kurkov, who offers a unique perspective on Ukrainian society, identity, and resilience, we hope to foster meaningful discussions and insights. Thank you all for joining us in this valuable opportunity to explore literature's role in reflecting and influencing our world, and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Before we start the program, I would like to mention that you have an opportunity to ask questions and write them in the Q&A part of the webinar on the bottom of the menu, and it will be answered at the end of this webinar. If you have any questions about recording, like I got many emails about it, yes, we are recording this session and we will be putting it up on the UCLA Library YouTube channel. You have also an option to do captioning on your own menu. You can click on the CC sign and try to put your captioning on. The captioning will be also available on the recording. So I would like to welcome very much Andrey Kurkov, and I hope he is okay in Kiev and he is healthy and not affected by the horrible war in Ukraine. And I know he is a very celebrated Ukrainian novelist and screenwriter, renowned for his sharp wit and satirical portrayal of post-Soviet life. Mr. Kurkov is the author of numerous novels, including the widely acclaimed Death and the Penguin, which has been translated into over 30 languages. His work explores identity and also politics and the complexities of the contemporary Ukrainian society. Beyond his novels, Mr. Kurkov is a prominent commentator on Ukrainian's political landscape, and he contributes regularly to international publications such as The Guardian, The New York Times, and so on. Today, he will share insights into his literary works, his experiences as a writer in contemporary Ukraine, and his reflections on the current political landscape. Joining Mr. Kurkov is Dr. Roman Koropeckyj, a distinctive professor of Slavic, East European, and Eurasian languages and cultures here at UCLA. Dr. Koropeckyj is a leading scholar in Eastern European literature, specializing in Polish and Ukrainian literature with the focus on 19th century Romanticism and its influence on national identities. He is the author of several scholarly works, including Adam Mickiewicz, The Life of a Romantic, an acclaimed biography of Poland's national poet. Dr. Koropeckyj's extensive research and passion for Eastern European literature have established him as a prominent voice in the field, and his expertise will guide us through today's discussion, providing a deep exploration of Mr. Kurkov's unique perspectives on the intersection of literature and society. Thank you all for joining us today in what promises to be an enlightening conversation on literature's role in shaping our understanding of society, identity, and resilience. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming our esteemed speakers, Andrey Kurkov and Dr. Roman Koropeckyj.
Thank you. Before I begin with some questions, I would just like to add some little bit to the introduction, namely that the two most recent books of Andrey Kurkov that have been published in the United States, Gray Bees and The Silver Bone, are both the products of, or both translations of one of our leading former graduate students, graduates, and a friend of mine, Boris Droluk, for which his translation of Gray Bees won a very prestigious award. So I would like to just bring him into the conversation here, because in a sense he is a medium, because we will be talking about Gray Bees and Silver Bone, I hope, a little bit later on. The first question that I would like to ask you is based on a quote that I found rather interesting for a number of reasons from the preface in the Diary of an Invasion. And this, by the way, is the first volume of I guess, a diptych of your experiences, nonfiction experience, your diaries over the past close to 3 years of the war. I don't think the second one has yet been published. What is it? Our Daily
It's
War, right?
it's published in London, but not in the US. But
Although it is available on Kindle. So
yes, it
please,
is available. Yeah.
please get it.
Yeah.
In any case, there's a wonderful, very interesting quote in the preface to the Diary of Invasion, and I'll read it here, and I would like to hear you comment on it. This war has given me the opportunity to better understand Ukraine and my Ukrainian compatriots. I have met hundreds of people, heard hundreds of stories, and I have been given insights into things about Ukraine that I did not understand before. During these tragic months, Ukrainians have learned and understood a lot about their homeland and about themselves. War is not the best time for such discoveries, but without the war, these discoveries would not have come to light. There's a lot of things in that quote to unpack, and I would like to start with the first one. Although you write this about people you call your Ukrainian compatriots, I at least, and please correct me if I'm wrong, get the sense here almost as if you're viewing them from the outside. Perhaps not so much like Gogol views his Russian peasants in Dead Souls, but nonetheless. So what exactly is it that you did not understand before about Ukraine and Ukrainians? How have your views changed or evolved in this regard, particularly over these past 10 years? And mind you, 10 years because it's the anniversary of 2014, obviously, this month. Please.
Good morning and good day and good evening to everyone. Well, it's a very good question. It's a very complex question, and it will take time to answer it. But first of all, what I mean that I discovered a lot of things I did not know about my compatriots. Because first of all, we should understand that actually mentality of Ukrainians is different from mentality of Russians. Historically different, because in the 16th century, there was so-called Cossack society, Cossack territory on the territory of today's Ukraine, which was independent. It was not a kingdom. Ukrainians never had a royal family, but they were able to choose their leaders, who were called headmans. And actually, I think from this moment, there is a feeling in every Ukrainian put in genetically, almost genetically, that they can influence the politics, that they are not passive, but at the same time, they're individualists. Because, I mean, Russian mentality is collective mentality. I mean, Russia was always a monarchy for over 1,000 years. So, I mean, the subjects of the monarchies were loyal. They loved their tsars. When they were not happy with them, they would kill one and love another one, and still would expect presents from the tsars and would not show any initiative. So, I mean, they were, and they are manipulated easily, influenced by propaganda, etc. Ukrainians are very different. They are individualists, and this was the reason why, for example, Lenin never trusted Ukrainians and never came to Kiev, because he understood that with this mentality, I mean, it's impossible to force Ukrainians to build communist society. And as we know, Ukrainians didn't want to join collective farms, Ukrainian farmers. And in the end of 1920s, several hundred thousands of farmers were deported to Siberia as a punishment. So, I mean, we can go on and on finding the examples. And this individualism meant that actually in independent Ukraine, before the war, there were 40 million different images of Ukraine. Every Ukrainian had his own image of Ukraine in which he lives or he would like to live, whereas in Russia, everyone has the same image of Great Russia. So for me, the main discovery was on the second day of the full-scale invasion, when we were leaving Kyiv by car with my wife to go to Lviv to pick up our children, to go to the border, to find a place to stay as displaced persons. We came across dozens of cases of incredible friendship and friendliness and readiness to help. So, I mean, the Ukrainians suddenly became collective in the face of the danger. Collective in the sense that they were helping each other. They were collaborating with each other. They were actually, I mean, like when we got in the end to Uzhgorod, and we didn't have a place to stay. A lady we never met gave us the key from her apartment, and she moved in with her daughter and daughter's family. And we stayed 4 months in this small apartment on the border with Slovakia. And underneath, by the entrance to the house, there was an old Lada car with a notice attached. If you need help to transport something or somebody, please call this mobile number. So, I mean, I can give you lots of examples. So, I mean, suddenly Ukraine, which was very anarchic, and I mean, it is an anarchic society, because, I mean, this Cossack society was practically the motherland of anarchy, because everyone was ready to take responsibility for the territory, for something else. And the result today is that we have more than 400 political parties registered in the Ministry of Justice. So I mean, this is very different temper, different attitude, different approach to political, social life. And the fact that actually hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian men in the beginning of the full-scale invasions volunteered, even without weapons, to go to the front lines to defend their country. It was incredible. I mean, at the same time, dozens of thousands of Ukrainians who lived for many years abroad were crossing border into Ukraine to defend their motherland, which they abandoned because of the economical reasons. And this was probably for me the biggest experience in my life. Of course, I mean, life is different now. I am different now than I was before 24th of February 2022. And if we compare the situation in 2022 with 2014, when the war actually began, it's very different. It was not so dramatic then, because then the war became the continuation of the Euromaidan, of the protests on Maidan, of the murder by snipers of 100 of protesters in the central part of Kiev. So it was like reprisal. It was, I mean, it was clear that something is going to happen, but it was not like bombing or shelling all of the country with missiles indiscriminately, killing civilians, destroying high rises, etc. So, I mean, 2022 is a separate case. And because of this being so special, so different, the Ukrainians showed themselves differently. And of course, you mentioned, yes, I just one more thing. Ukrainians never knew their history, majority of Ukrainians. And when full-scale invasion started, suddenly the soldiers who volunteered to fight for Ukraine from the trenches, they were asking their friends and relatives to send them books, non-fiction books on Ukrainian history, because they wanted finally to understand what country they are fighting for. And this was very touchy.
I mean, I want to follow up on what you just said, because what you said was there was a contrast between Ukrainian societies and Russian societies based on collective and non-collective. And then you said that now suddenly you see with the war and the way people are reacting towards the war, that there's a sense of collectivity, of collective responsibility among Ukrainians. May we not put this in a different way, that what you're seeing rather is the ability of Ukrainians to mobilize on an individual basis, because it is largely a civil society, something that is lacking in Russia, a society that is willing, that is capable of functioning horizontally rather than vertically according to command.
You are 100% right. To say more, that actually in Ukraine from 2014, civil society is much stronger than political elite. And the politicians are afraid of civil society. So they were trying actually to employ civil society activists to supervise the work of ministries and committees, etc. So there were special bodies organized for civil society members to show that they are appreciated, that their opinion is valued, etc. And yes, I mean, this mobilization still, I mean, it was mobilization of civil society, But there, at that moment, actually, the people who were not before the members of civil society, they joined in. So, I mean, the civil society became much more powerful. But in this collective movement, actually, it was really, I mean, it was an action from the bottom, not from the top. I mean, nobody told them to go and to fight. Actually, I mean, there was a problem to find arms because, I mean, the military didn't know how to deal with these volunteers who come and ask to be sent to fight the enemy, and were asking for the ammunition and weapons. So yes, but I believe, I mean, this collectivity, which is out here because of the necessity, it will mostly disappear once the war is over, the situation is stable, although, I mean, who knows where it will be, because ahead of us, after the end of the war, a huge task of rebuilding the country, which will need another mobilization, another collective effort of civil society.
I want to use this notion of civil society to do a little plug for you. You wrote a very, very interesting book that also became part of a nonfiction book. And you wrote a nonfiction book that also became part of a fiction book about the Emmaus House in Lviv, a home for the homeless and taking care of the homeless. And I think this is a very good, I hope that somebody translates it sooner, because I think it's a very touching book in many ways. And it makes a very nice appearance in Jimi Hendrix Lviv. But I hope somebody translates this into English, because I think it shows an interesting different side of you that I think is worth people knowing. Do you want to say something about about that book?
Well, I mean, Emmaus International, that's the organization which helps
Right.
homeless worldwide. I mean, I came across them when I was writing the book about Lviv, about Jimi Hendrix in Lviv, and I'm still in touch with them. I'm still sort of a member of this organization. And I'm very happy that actually my son is an active member of another similar organization, Saint Egidio, here in Kyiv. But yeah, I think it's about charity, and charity is also a feature of Ukrainian society. And I think charity plays its own role also now in this war, because, I mean, volunteers' actions, the fundraising and everything else for the army, for the wounded, for the displaced, for the refugees, it's all done on a huge scale already for 2.5 years, and it's going on. So I'm happy that I wrote this book 10 years ago, actually, and it is still, well, what do you call it?
Relevant. Yep.
Relevant, yes,
Yeah,
relevant.
absolutely, particularly in the United States. I want to go back to the original quote here and the way you answered it, because you, again, and maybe I'm not wrong, you did say, as a Russian, I'm looking at the Ukrainians in a particular way. And I want this to lead to a few more questions that I have. Do you really do feel a sense of being a kind of you're a Ukrainian citizen, you're very much part of the Ukrainian society, you're a spokesman for Ukraine over the past few years, but do you still feel as if you're some kind of outside of it, capable of observing it as an outsider?
Well, the word Ukrainian in the Soviet time meant somebody of Ukrainian ethnic origin. And word Russian meant all the same, somebody who considers himself of ethnic Russian origin. After 1991, Ukrainians are citizens of Ukraine of any origin, and I am Ukrainian of Russian origin. But I should say that actually there are people, of course, there are ethnic Ukrainians in Ukraine who don't consider ethnic Russians Ukrainians, even if they have Ukrainian passport and grew up in Ukraine and speak Ukrainian. So, I mean, there is always some kind of small tension with somebody who will point you at your origin or your place of birth. So, I mean, I never say I am Russian. I always say I am Ukrainian. I feel Ukrainian, but I'm aware of this sometimes daily situation, because of course I mean I'm a public figure, like for example Vakhtang Kipiani, a Ukrainian of Georgian origin, very well-known historian and journalist. He is very often on Facebook sort of attacked and told that he is not Ukrainian, he is from Caucasus, etc. So I mean, this is the issue. It's not my issue or his issue. It is issue of somebody who is not happy that there are public figures in Ukrainian society of non-Ukrainian ethnic origin. I mean, it doesn't bother me. It doesn't influence my regard, the way I look at the society. And I'm surprised that I put this phrase in the book, frankly speaking.
Cross that out, censor yourself.
Yes.
But let's keep on to this subject, because it's no matter how, and I understand everything that you say right now, and you know, people who are citizens of Ukraine are Ukrainians the way citizens of the United States are Americans, I guess. But the issue that you do always raise and cannot but raise is the fact that although you're a Ukrainian writer, you write primarily in Russian. Your fiction is almost all exclusively written in Russian. And as you well know, and I think many of our audience knows, that the language question in Ukraine is a very, very fraught set question. It is something that's at the very center of notions of Ukrainian identity, whether rightly or wrongly, but it's very much there. And the question I want to ask is, one of the putative justifications that Putin had for invading Ukraine was to protect Russian speakers who were being purportedly persecuted by Ukrainian nationalists. And the issue has become more and more, even more fraught over the past few years, when we realize that on the one hand, Russian, and not just Pelevin or Akunin or Sorokin, or, well, I should say not just Prilepin, but also Akunin, Sorokin, Pelevin, and the classics too of Russian literature, Pushkin, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and so on, is now Russian being now is a language of an army that is committing unspeakable atrocities in Ukraine, and who, if they could, would kill you and your family without thinking twice. So as a Ukrainian writer who writes predominantly in Russian, you have, at least before 2014, openly promoted and defended the status as well as the prestige of the Russian language in Ukraine. Have your views changed on this subject in any way? Are you thinking about this differently?
I didn't promote Russian language, and I didn't promote any prestige of Russian language. My idea, 2015, well, if you can give me an example how I promote it.
It was, I mean, not promotion, but the fact that you defended the use of Russian in Ukraine, and in English publications to boot.
Let me say, I defended Russian language Ukrainian writers and poets and their right to write in Ukrainian version of Russian language. And I was saying that actually, in order to create peaceful cultural coexistence, it would be a good idea to have just an office in the Academy of Sciences of Ukraine to study the Ukrainian version of Russian language, which existed here for 3 centuries, and which has also different forms in Odessa Russian language and in Kharkiv, etc. Of course, I mean, this idea was heavily criticized, and I was, how to say politely, I was told that I'm very wrong, and it was 15 years ago, or maybe even 20 years ago, and I don't think well, the society was ready, because my point of view was that Ukraine is a multicultural state. It has up to 24 of minorities. Some minorities have their cultures and literatures. I mean, we have about 60 writers and poets who write in Hungarian language. Their books are not translated into Ukrainian. They are not known to anybody except their small circle in Western Ukraine, in Transcarpathian region. We have a writer who writes in Gagauz language. It is a Turkic language. It's a minority that lives in Odessa region in Bessarabia. We have still quite a lot of poets and novelists who write in Russian, but they don't publish books. Most of them don't publish books in Russian. And actually, I don't publish books in Russian. My books are now published at once in the Ukrainian translation. I do write also in Ukrainian and in English. But fiction, as you said, I write in my mother tongue, in Russian. But I would not defend any status of Russian language, of course, today, even though that the first victims of Russian army were Russian-speaking inhabitants of Mariupol, Akhtirka, Donbass cities, south of Ukraine, Kherson, which is also largely Russian-speaking, and suburbs of Kiev, where actually Russian and Ukrainian coexisted. So it's out of the question now. But I mean, romantic idealists who believe that it is possible to turn 10 or 15 millions of Ukrainians into Ukrainian speakers overnight, and especially if we are talking not about intellectuals. It's just instigation of another conflict on another level. And we don't need internal conflicts. I mean, I speak Ukrainian, and I don't remember when I had last public event in Russian, probably last century. And I learned Ukrainian actually in the Soviet time, in 1970s in the school, and I worked as an editor in the Ukrainian State Publishing House in 1980s, editing translations from foreign languages into Ukrainian of novels from Western Europe and from the States. So, I mean, you cannot say that I was actually promoting Ukrainian in the Soviet time. And in the post-Soviet time, I was mostly involved in promoting Ukrainian literature abroad and supporting Ukrainian young writers in Ukraine with different projects and different literary competitions.
You know, this brings up, I think, a very interesting question that I also had. Although I have a few comments about, well, we might be able to talk about this, about your attitude towards those Ukrainian writers who are essentially talking about, quote unquote, canceling Russian literature, Russian language, and so forth, at least for the time during the war. But we might get into this. Actually, there's something different that I wanted to talk about in this regard. Is what was interesting. You belong to a generation, a remarkable generation of writers in Ukraine. The ones who debuted in the 1980s, the late 1980s and then early 1990s. People like Yuri Andrukhovich, Izrik, Kosmo Skalech, Oksana Zabusko. We can name a whole bunch of them. But what's very interesting is that you were the first, or I would say you became the most prominent voice of that generation abroad. And it is only relatively recently that we see translations of some of the people that I've just mentioned being promulgated and people being in publishing houses being interested in their work and so forth. We could talk about this as well, because there's something perverse about the fact that war creates interest in a person's literature and culture and so forth. But in any case, how do you explain the fact that it was, and you, by the way, you can be as immodest as you want in this answer, but how do you explain the fact that it was you who were the first one to be translated of that generation and get this kind of popularity in comparison to some of the other fellow Ukrainian writers who wrote in Ukrainian?
Well, it's not a question of language.
You don't think
It's
so? Okay. Mhm.
well, because what I did for 18 years, I sent around the world around 1,000 manuscripts and samples of my texts in English,
Mm,
trying to find a publisher or an agent abroad. Nobody else
I
among
see.
my colleagues was doing the same. And after 18 years, actually, after first 40 rejections, Death and the Penguin was accepted by Swiss publishing house Diogenes. And I was asked by the Diogenes to learn German in order to present this book in German, in Germany, in Switzerland, and in Austria. And I learned German. And in 1999, the book was published in March, and in June it became first bestseller from post-Soviet space in German language space. And I started actually traveling in German-speaking countries, presenting this book and continuing writing other books. So, I mean, I was working on it. I mean, my colleagues were not so much interested. They were hoping that somebody will discover them. I wanted to be discovered.
See, that's what I wanted to hear. That's precisely what I wanted to hear.
And I have the biggest collection of rejections from all around the world in my possession, in my archive.
So exactly, that's what I meant by you should not be you should not be immodest about it. It was simply a matter of being able to sell oneself, or the urge and the push to sell oneself in
Yep.
comparison to the other writers who, as you said,
Yes.
were just waiting for themselves to be discovered. But this is the question that it leads to this thing that I was hinting on a little earlier. Is I've heard from several writers that the war, and maybe even before the war, but the war has, well, first of all, we know in terms of pure quantity that the war has created a veritable renaissance, a burgeoning of Ukrainian literature, particularly poetry, right? We know prose is something that comes later, but poetry. And at the same time, too, they also write that the war has renewed their language, renewed their capacity as poets, because it's forcing them to look at the world in a different way. Do you find that there's something perverse, and what can even expand this? Suddenly, everybody's interested in Ukrainian literature in the West. You find something perverse about the fact that it takes traumatic experiences such as this, or what happened in Eastern Europe in the 1970s, for the Western world to suddenly pay attention to this culture?
Well, I mean, I've heard a lot of times that the war turned out to be the best publicity for Ukrainian culture, and I hate this idea. I mean, it is right. People want to know more about Ukraine. Non-fiction books about Ukraine, those by Timothy Snyder, Martin Pollack, Anne Applebaum, and others, Serhiy Plokhy, I mean, they are translated now and sold in huge quantities. The world is studying Ukraine and studying Ukrainian culture and literature, but at the same time, I mean, we can publish a red book of Ukrainian culture, because, I mean, thousands of representatives of Ukrainian culture are dead. They are killed by Russians. I mean, we have a huge number, 50 or 60 Ukrainian poets who are killed in the war. One was executed, Volodymyr Vakulenko. Ukrainian novelists stopped writing novels. They started writing nonfiction, diaries, and actually we have now a situation when, and including myself, yes, but I mean, we have a situation that majority of readers in Ukraine read now foreign books. So 80% of the books on the market are translations. And actually, today I read one editor complaining that he was trying to turn bloggers' attention to Ukrainian young authors, and the literary bloggers continue to write about foreign best-selling authors who have just been published in Ukrainian. So yes, I mean, the war did underline that Ukrainian culture and literature exist. But if you walk into a French or German bookshop now, you don't see separately collected books by Ukrainian writers or on Ukraine like it was in the first 18 months of the war. This phase is finished. So, and now actually some authors who were published, translated and published, then the books were sold and they were not reprinted because, I mean, the publishers think that the moment is already gone. So I mean, did Ukraine use this chance fully? Well, I mean, definitely yes, but not to the full extent. And of course, I mean, and Ukrainian authors should be much more present now at book fairs, at book festivals, and at the universities. Thanks God, I know that actually there was now several tours of Ukrainian poets in the States, visiting universities, including Stanford and San Diego. And,
UCLA as well. Okay.
in LA also. So I mean, like Alina Kruk was there probably, Yakiva.
Husseinova, Yakimovich.
Yeah.
Oh, Yakimchuk.
So I mean, this is the result. This is the result of the war. If there was no war, they wouldn't be invited now to come and to talk and to read and to have books in English. It's very important.
But but why? How would you explain that? Would you explain that? And certainly, you know, is that a question of quality, that it's not worth the world to look at without the war?
Well, I mean, without the war, competition is too high.
Ah, okay.
And at the same time, I mean, for example, do you have any poets from Gaza visiting you now?
Well, they're probably not allowed to because they're considered to be terrorists.
Yeah. So not every war creates this situation. Sure. Yes. But generally, of course, I mean, it would be much better to have this without war. But it didn't happen without war. And actually, without war, probably many universities would prefer to invite poets from Russia than poets from Ukraine. Because Russia was co-financing promotion of its culture, of its literature, whereas Ukraine never paid much attention to its own culture until 2017 or 16, when finally four new cultural institutions were created in the states that are run actually by the state system.
Now that you've brought up the question, and you did, you know, I wasn't going to ask this, but you brought it up, the question of festivals and the question of Ukrainian writers and of course Russian writers appearing in festivals, and the whole question of should they be. There's been a big discussion in Ukraine right now. Should Ukrainian writers appear in the same panels or even at the same festivals as Russian writers? And I know that there was a big controversy with you, for instance, personally, when you appeared on the same stage with Masha Gessen, and what was it, a year ago, I think it is, and it's a controversy, it's still going on. What's your attitude towards that version of cancel culture, or attitude, or strategy?
Well, I am very negative about it. I understand not taking part in a festival together with Prilepin or with Putin Z poets and Z writers and those who support Russian politics and government and the war. But ignoring writers who support Ukraine actively and who are sometimes even sentenced in absentia for supporting Ukraine, like Masha Gessen. I mean, she is sentenced in Moscow to 8 or 9 years. It's not logical, because I mean, Russia remains our neighbor, bad neighbor, but it will always be there on the east. And it's better to have somebody on our side, even if this somebody cannot go back to Russia. But this somebody can talk in Europe, in America, can work for Ukrainian interests, for Ukrainian cultural interests. And in this sense, Vladimir Sorokin, Mikhail Shishkin, Masha Gessen, and some Sasha Filipenko from Belarus, who lives in Switzerland. I mean, these are friends of Ukraine. They are not enemies of Ukraine. So, I mean, I don't see any reason to attack them.
Okay. I'm going to turn a little bit to your writing and to your literature. We don't have that much time because I'd like to have the audience involved in some of this. But I want to take two of your books that I found interesting for a number of reasons: The President's Last Love and then Jimi Hendrix and Lviv. Now, The President's Last Love was written in 2004, right?
Yes.
And considering its setting and context, would you say that writing it in Russian imbued it with a greater sense of verisimilitude or realism than it would have if it was written in Ukrainian?
Well, can you imagine Putin speaking Ukrainian in a book?
Well, it's not so much Putin, it's the Ukrainian president that I'm talking about and his milieu.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
exactly what I mean.
Yeah.
How do you, it creates a very interesting problem because there's Ukrainian writers who are writing about the same thing, but they're writing it in Ukrainian.
Well, I mean, for me, it was natural to write this book in Russian, of course, because I'm a Russian speaker.
Right.
Yeah. But generally, it's about post-Soviet space. And it's about post-Soviet Ukrainian president who becomes accidentally Ukrainian president, who doesn't like his job, etc. And it's about future of Ukraine because, I mean, it's about past 1970s and 90s, and it's about 2017, 2014, etc. And in this book, actually, not only poisoning of Yushchenko is predicted and described, but also annexation of Crimea.
Yeah, right.
And the promises of Putin practically to take over Kiev. So yes, it is. In this sense, it's more about Russia than about Ukraine. It's more about imperial ambition of Putin and of Russia, and their claims on everything around them.
But did you think when you were writing it, obviously, you know, your first language is Russian, you write in Russian, but were you actually thinking about the fact that I am being more realistic when I'm writing about this in Russian?
I don't remember because, can you imagine 20 years ago, I was a slightly different person. But no, I didn't think. I mean, I had another novel which is called A Good Angel of Death, which was written as a bilingual novel where some characters speak Ukrainian, some characters speak Russian, and it's about Ukraine, Caucasus, and Kazakhstan. And I would say that then actually I understood how important it is to have Ukrainian in the book.
So in that question, what about Jimi Hendrix and Lviv?
Jimi Hendrix and Lviv was published at the same time in Russian and Ukrainian.
Okay, I see. But
Yeah.
as a translation, though.
Yes, yes. And
so you wrote it. So you wrote it in Russian.
I wrote it in Russian, and I think I translated it myself.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, while working on this novel, I went approximately 40 times to Lviv, and in Lviv, I spoke Galician Ukrainian.
Yeah. I wouldn't be proud of that sometimes, but I'm just kidding. But that's an interesting question. Then, how did using different languages? I assume it wasn't an exact translation because it couldn't be, right, between Russian and Ukrainian. Were you rewriting the work in Ukrainian or were you translating it?
No, I was translating it. I wasn't rewriting it. But I should say that when I was 17, 18 until the age of 24, I wrote poetry. And I wrote poems in 3 languages, in Russian, Ukrainian, and in English.
Not in Japanese?
No. But I spoke some Japanese, yes. But I remember that the language dictated the intonation, the music. And all my poems in English were depressive. All my poems in Ukrainian were funny. And all my poems in Russian were full of paradoxes and absurdities. But for me, it was a great, actually, positive shock that when in 2012, the Jimi Hendrix Live in Lemberg was published at the same time in Russian and in Ukrainian, the sales in Ukrainian were 3 times higher than sales in Russian. And it made me think about this, because I mean it was very, very unusual information to digest.
Speaking of the mood of each language, the most depressing book of yours that I have read was the first one, the Bickford Files, Bickford Fuse, which is in Russian. Yeah. And you at one point say, and I guess it was written in 1989, and I assume that you say in 1993 that this is the dearest and most important of your works. By the way, I don't think I finished it. I found it so depressing. And do you still feel that way about the book? And how do you feel that you've evolved from the vision and even the style then till what you're writing now?
Well, I do very different books now, right? But I spent 4 years writing the Bickford Fuse, and it was important for me because in 1980, when my grandfather died, I found out from my parents, who'd never told me before about this, that his 2 brothers were arrested in the 1930s, sent to Gulag, and sentenced to 25 years, etc. And I decided to discover real history of the Soviet Union. It was still Soviet time. And I was traveling by hitchhiking and river hiking with a big dictation machine, looking for old important people, VIP pensioners, who could tell me the truth. I was pretending that I'm a student of journalism. And I discovered so many surreal stories about Soviet past, about the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s. And actually, this novel, Bickford Fuse, is my first reaction to this real surreal Soviet history hidden from the Soviet people. Then actually I wrote a trilogy, a geography of single gunshot, which is easier to read, but much larger picture, with similar level of surrealism and black humor. And then I finished my craze to discover more about the Soviet history with the novel The Gardens of Mr. Michurin. Michurin was favorite botanist of Stalin. And then I thought that, well, now I know everything what I needed about the Soviet past, and it's now over, and now let's observe post-Soviet reality.
And now, speaking of post-Soviet reality, and this will be my final question, at one point you've already spoken about this, and I even think that you wrote this in the preface of your diary, that once the war broke out, you just couldn't write fiction. And now you're back to writing fiction, and which means that you're back to writing fiction as the war is still going on, and as you've had an experience of what it means to be in the war. And as we know from your work is very often seems to, even though, for instance, Last Loves of the President and other things are, very much part, and The Silver Bone they're very concretely based, but there's also, they exist in a world somehow parallel to the real world. How much do you feel, because you were already finished with the second part of this last trilogy, right?
I finished the third part. The
you already
is,
finished with the third part. Okay.
Yeah, the second is out in March. In
March, great. Could you please tell the audience what it's called?
The Stolen Heart.
The Stolen Heart. Okay, very good. Boris Dreluk, translator again.
Yes, it's his brilliant work, for which I'm very grateful.
Now, do you feel that, or how has the experience of these past few years affected what you write and how you write?
Well, probably the main issue is that I cannot write fiction about reality now. I continue writing nonfiction. I'm asked to write third book of essays, of diary-like essays about what is happening. But separately, I can write about events of 1919, 1920, so-called civil war between the Red Army and the White Army in Russia, but 7 armies in this war involved, actually 2 wars in Ukraine. So I'm, in a way, escaping in my fiction today's reality, replacing it with the similar reality, but happening 100 years before.
Has it affected your style?
Yes, I think I have less humor now and maybe more dramatic moments. And I feel a necessity to introduce, in fact, actually some moments of violence. Yeah, in this historic crime novels.
Okay, very good. So, shall we open the thing up for a discussion? Thank you very, very much, and I hope that some of our questions, what you've said, some people will be following up on. So I am now going to begin looking at some of the questions that have been sent in with a question and answer, and the first one from Vadim Schneider, one of my colleagues in the Slavic department. Oops. That was just a question for something else. Maybe he'll provide a question later on. From Hanna Lasovsky. And she writes, in 2006, Kipiani was doing Medvedchuk's personal bidding by trying to discredit Ukrainian diaspora's attempts to nominate Stus to the Nobel Prize. In your 2006 article, Independent Ukraine as a Function of Soviet Inertia, you were critical about first years of Ukrainian independence and even put rehabilitation of Tychina in quotes. Was your article the part of the same guided movement?
Well, I was writing at that time what I was thinking and what I was observing. And actually, the beginning of 1990s, these are the years for which Ukraine cannot be proud. We gave the initiative to ex-communists who announced themselves nationalists, who removed Vyacheslav Chernovil from active politics and in the end killed him. I don't know what was Vakhtang Kipiani doing at that time. I didn't follow him and I did not know him. But I always wrote in the articles what I felt and thought at this moment. Sometimes I was wrong, sometimes I was right. But I don't remember all the articles I wrote.
Okay, that's always a good thing to say. From Jessica, something on a completely different subject. Jessica Ginocchio writes, I'm currently writing a dissertation about animals in East European fiction. So I'm interested to hear your own view of what role animals play in your work, and they do play a role. Why do animals appeal to you as a fiction writer? It also seems to me like including animals, particularly wild animals like penguins, is a trend in contemporary literature. She says, I'm also thinking of Yoko Tawada and Lenore Goralik.
Well, I think animals and children are innocent and they are natural. And in this sense, actually, they are sometimes in good contrast with unnatural behavior of other characters or unnatural situation in which the characters find themselves. So, I mean, in Death and the Penguin, actually, both main character Victor and Penguin Misha, they find themselves in unnatural situations. Because, I mean, Victor, who was anti-Soviet, Soviet person, suddenly realized that he is on his own, and he is actually a representative of collective mentality about which we talked before, and he cannot learn very quickly how to become an individual. And penguins actually are naturally collective animals. So if you separate a penguin from a group and put this penguin on an uninhabited island, the penguin will get lost. It will be disorientated. So in this sense, actually, I think it's quite clear what role the penguin plays in the novel.
What about the gulls in Jimi Hendrix?
Well, I mean, this is, I would say, a reference to the birds of Alfred Hitchcock, but it's also, more secretly, it's about contradiction between Russian-speaking Odessa on the sea coast and Ukrainian-speaking Lviv missing the sea.
Even though they're right on top of it.
Yeah, on the top of Carpathians, ancient one.
Oh, actually, that brings up, since you know, I'm waiting for some more questions here. I'll continue to keep things going. As a writer who's probably traveled all over Ukraine, how strongly do you? I mean, obviously, Galicia, Western Ukraine, is the obvious question, or the obvious example here. But how strongly do you feel Ukraine as a regional entity?
Well, Ukraine is 26 regions officially, and most of the regions are very different and have slightly different or very different mentality, history, traditions, etc., and even different recipes of borscht. I mean, it's good and it's bad. It means that actually Ukrainian politicians never worked on mutual integration of the regions. So I mean, we have these regions, but we don't have national cultural space, for example. We never had a national film premiere in all regions of Ukraine on the same day. We never had a book launch on the same day in every region, etc. So it should be done. It will be done later after the war. But actually, I mean, Bukovina, for example, yes, definitely is a separate region, and I want to say separate state, separate history than Lviv or than Uzhgorod and Zakarpattia. And in fact, actually, I traveled to Donbass before the war several times and 3 times during the war. And I felt very sorry that actually this region was left to be controlled by local mafia for 30 years. And only because of this, actually, we have the situation there today. And only because of these people there, they very often didn't feel themselves Ukrainians or accepted as Ukrainians. Yeah.
And do you feel this this regionalism strongly as far as writers are concerned? Can you identify that these are particular? I mean, in Poland, for instance, that's one of the things they talk about, little homelands. Can you talk about little homelands in literature in Ukraine, do you think?
Yes. I mean, although I wouldn't say that, for example, literary circle of Ivano-Frankivsk is a regional, it's national circle. But for example, literary scene in Transcarpathian region, it's a local literature. It's very interesting with writers of
Lubka?
Andrey Lubka, Sergei Fedaka. There are several more interesting and not really enough appreciated authors who remained local writers only because we still have regional cultures instead of national culture.
I have a new question here from Nicoleta Ifrim. Do you think that the displaced identity of Ukrainian refugees is different from the displaced identity of other post-Soviet migrants? For instance, the ones of the Romanian post-totalitarian migrants to the West?
Well, I met a lot of Ukrainian refugees during my trips in the last 2.5 years. I mean, many of them are lost. So if you ask them about their identity, probably they will not be able to tell you, because for them the main issue is, the main question is to come back to Ukraine or not to come back, and if not to come back, what to do, how to survive. And it requires a lot of very difficult decisions. The active Ukrainian migrants, or I mean, people who came actually to Western Europe, for example, not because of the war. They are the most active representatives of Ukrainian identity, because, I mean, they became activists in fundraising for Ukrainian army and hospitals. They became political advocates for Ukraine. They are organizing protests and pickets and different meetings. And actually, I'm waiting now for a friend, a retired editor from Netherlands, who is bringing to Ukraine now an ambulance car. So, I mean, he was influenced also by these Ukrainians who have been living in Netherlands already for 10, 15 years. And actually, those who came as refugees, they are keeping low profile. They don't want really to open up to majority of them to talk about their situation, their identity, the problem they face.
Again, I'm waiting for some more questions, so I will, as they say, the worst thing in the world in radio is empty space. So you can never allow that. So the next question I have for you is, what are your relationships with Russian writers at the moment? I mean, Russian writers. How do you, what's astonishing to me, for instance, is somebody like Prilepin, who, when I first read him, I was astonished by his talent. I think he's an extraordinarily talented writer. And then suddenly, as we know what happened with him, what are your relationships to those writers, for instance, that you respected as talents and then saw them as politically completely untenable? Have you broken relations? Do you stop reading them? What happened?
My books were first time banned in Russia in 2005. And from that moment, and maybe from 2008, actually, I had almost no connections with writers in Russia. I was, and I think I am still a friend of Vladimir Sorokin. I helped to organize publication of his novels in Ukrainian translation. I followed Mikhail Shishkin, whom I already mentioned. In these 2.5 years, I received only one message from a writer who is still in Moscow, who is still writing something and not saying anything about the war. And he just sent a message that he supports Ukraine secretly. And that's all. And I mean, I lost interest to all representatives of this literary society of Russian Federation, because I mean, I checked on Facebook pages, on the blogs of some of the writers, and I noticed that actually a large majority of them who consider themselves liberals actually don't mention Ukraine at all, and they go on attending book fairs in Russia and book festivals and very happy, and writing about film premieres, and don't care about Ukraine or Russian Kremlin's politics. So I have no interest, and I don't think I will ever have any interest to them in the future.
What was it when you were talking about that? Many of them liberals. I think it was Vinnychenko had a very famous comment that Russian liberalism stops at the border of Ukraine, right?
Yeah, I agree. It is true.
We have a provocative question. Why not, right?
Yes.
Has Putin done a better job at Ukrainian nation building than the Ukrainian political leaders and governments in the post-Soviet period, not only for foreigners.
Well, he did consolidate the nation, and actually, the nation was very united after the beginning of the full-scale invasion, and there were no sort of conflicting situations, neither between Russian speakers or Ukrainian speakers, etc. But it's true, but the main problem is that Ukrainian politicians were hopeless for more than 30 years. And if they were active, if they were really interested in the future of Ukraine, we wouldn't have this war. We would have a stable democracy, a stable country with national cultural space, with all the problems solved by the civil society together with the politicians.
But it was a democracy.
Yeah.
There's one positive thing that one can say, at least. I have another question. Again, I'm waiting for some more. Again, about your writing. You've clearly it seems to me in the more recent times, there seems to be a kind of a movement on your part to kind of write maybe more in Ukrainian, or think about writing in Ukrainian, or at least translating your own work in Ukrainian. Have you ever thought of writing something that would be full of surjik? And surjik, by the way, for everybody who doesn't know, is this strange patois of Ukrainian and Russian, a mixture of like Spanglish in English.
Yeah. Well, actually, I mean, we had several writers who wrote in surjik, and I liked the books. One of them was Bogdan Zholdak, quite well-known professor in the theater college and a writer. I did use surjik as the language some of the characters spoke in my books, but also, I mean, I used it for the same reason that others despise the surjik, because surjik is considered a marker of lack of education. It's like a language spoken by people living between city, Russian-speaking city, and Ukrainian-speaking villages. So I mean, they are original Ukrainian speakers, but they are using lots of Russian words, and in the end, actually, they are changing Russian words or changing Ukrainian words and creating their own sort of language.
Finally, Vadim Schneider, my colleague, who I thought had asked a question earlier, and now he has finally asked a question. It's a very interesting one. I'd like to have your response to this. Some writers have continued to write in a language that is marked by some catastrophe or crime, but the way they use that language changes. Paul Celan's post-war German comes to mind. Is there anything comparable happening among Russophone Ukrainian writers, including you? Are there comparable attempts to deform or transform the language in response to the war, and how it has changed the meaning of the Russian language? And I can add just very quickly to that there's certainly that's happened in Ukrainian. I want to hear what happened.
Well, I mean, from 1991, we had a number of writers who used to write in Russian and then switching into Ukrainian, like Andrey Kurkov, Irene Rozdobudko. Recently, 2 years ago, Volodymyr Rafeenko, probably the most prominent Russian language writer from Donetsk, announced that he will not write a word in Russian anymore. And he started writing novels in Ukrainian. They are edited by his friend, Ukrainian translator and poet Andrey Bondar. I think he's continuing to learn Ukrainian as a language of novels. Some writers, poets became more bilingual than before. I mean, like some poets started writing more in Ukrainian than in Russian, although before they would write only in Russian. In my case, I mean, I didn't notice much change because I did use Ukrainian language in my Russian language written novels a lot. I use Ukrainian I write nonfiction in Ukrainian. I wrote books for children in Ukrainian, and probably I will write more books for children in Ukrainian. But otherwise, just maybe the fact that I accept that I will not have books published in original, which is okay for me, because this is the way Russian language should pay. Because I mean, the bookshops don't want to sell books in Russian. The publishers don't see any sense to publish books in Russian in Ukraine, although some books are still published, but mostly collections of poetry. And so in this situation, there are writers like Ilarion Pavlyuk, who is extremely popular inside Ukraine, who writes already for a long time in Russian, translates himself, his novels into Ukrainian. They are published only in Ukrainian. And I mean, he is accepted and nobody attacks him. So probably the secret of not irritating some people will be just not to publish books in your mother tongue and publish them at once in Ukrainian translation.
And there's only so much paper, right?
Yeah.
If finally, we have a few more minutes left, and can I ask you to read something of yours for everybody that might be of interest? And it's your choice and in your language, if you want to read in Russian and then have it translate it into English, or read directly from English. We'd be more than happy to hear a little bit.
I think I have only this book next to me, which is the second volume of the diaries. I can write. I can read a page. The title is Christmas Day in Kiev. It's 25th of December 2022. Snow has already covered the earth, and when the sun reigns in the sky, its rays add bright gilding to the snow cover. All my previous winters, all my previous Christmas celebrations were peaceful. Snow emphasized the calm. The snow and the cold preserve life until spring, until the first warm weather. It seems to demand that everyone rest, avoiding unnecessary movement and noise. The snow affects the sounds of nature. It somehow keeps the sounds above the ground and prevents them from disturbing the hibernating moles and other inhabitants of Ukraine's rich black soil. Our family agreed to donate money to Ukrainian causes this year instead of buying presents. Late on Christmas Eve, however, I noticed my wife placing the children's red stockings around the stove, bulging with gifts as usual. It's just practical stuff, she explained. In the morning, more presents appeared from the children. It's all made in Ukraine, they declared. Christmas 2022 is not only special because it is tumultuous and war-scarred. This year, Ukrainians can choose to celebrate Christmas according to the Gregorian calendar, that is, with all of Europe, or according to the Julian calendar, as they did before with Russia and the Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. Last year, my village celebrated Christmas on January 6th and 7th, together with Russia, and in the village church of Saint Alexander Nevsky, with a priest called Alexander, a rather portly man with a habitually dissatisfied expression. It seems his wife had left him, taking the children with her. He remained alone, complaining often that his parish brought him little income. He earned extra money as a taxi driver and used car salesman.
Thank you. That was very nice. So I think we will finish here, and our host, Alina Asink, is going to have a few words to conclude everything. And when she's finished, I shall thank you. Please, Alina.
Thank you, Mr. Kurkov and Professor Koropeckyj, for a captivating conversation. Your insight of literature and situation in Ukraine have illuminated the vital role of literature that plays in such a trying times right now, and it's a helpful navigating through the complex of social and political landscapes that you provided, helping us to better understand the resilience and the identity of Ukraine and beyond. I would like to also mention that I find not only humor, but also beauty in your books. And I hope that everybody will try to get some readings that may be some older literature or the current one or upcoming one, and get familiar with what you have written. I think this is a very rare opportunity, and I'm very thankful for what you have done in previous, what you wrote, for you as a presence, for you fighting for Ukraine, and for coming here through Zoom to UCLA. And we truly appreciate it. And I hope that you will be healthy and you and your family will prosper, and that we will maybe see you in the future in person. I would like that. And I am sure many people would love that. And we hope that this conversation has expired many people, and that they explore new perspective, and that they will continue to support literature and to foster the understanding and connections of people in all of the world, and understand more Ukraine through your words. And I am so happy that you were part of our program here, and I thank you very much. And everybody who is in the audience, no matter where you are from, Europe or other countries, thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Koropeckyj, for your very good questions and for being our wonderful professor here at UCLA. And I hope maybe this will be a beginning of a friendship, and maybe Mr. Kurkov can come here and maybe even teach us a visiting professor. We will see. So thank you, and I wish you well.
And I too, thank you very much. It was a fascinating conversation. And I have to second what Alina just said. I hope we'll be able to bring you here for maybe a longer period of time and have more of these conversations over a large quantity of liquor that appears in every single one of your novels.
Except my children's books.
Okay, don't start there.
Thank you very much for excellent questions, Dr. Koropeckyj and Alina. Thank you very much for your kind words. And I am very grateful to everybody who attended this webinar. And I do hope that your interest in everything Ukrainian, especially in Ukrainian literature, will prevail and will lead you to many interesting discoveries.